This is apropos. The US president is urging Iranians to keep protesting against the country's theocratic leadership as international outrage grows over a crackdown one rights group says has likely killed thousands. The regime is insisting that it's regained control of the streets after more than 2 weeks of nationwide unrest that's posed one of the biggest challenges to the clerical leadership since it came to power in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Rights groups say nearly 17,000 protesters have been detained as concerns mount that at least one man already risks imminent execution. But with more on the international reaction, here's Eliza Herbert.
As patchy internet and phone services slowly start to return to Iran, more limited footage, such as this undated shot of protesters, is circulating outside of the country. And the full scale of the crackdown is beginning to take shape. From Geneva on Tuesday, a spokesperson for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights referenced conservative figures, saying hundreds of people have been killed and thousands arrested.
The killing of peaceful demonstrators must stop. The labelling of protesters as terrorists to justify violence against them is unacceptable.
The true death toll could be a lot higher. According to US-based human rights activist news agency, some 2,000 people have been killed. And Human Rights Watch says reports of other heinous violations and crimes are continuing to emerge, including that those detained are at risk of secret, arbitrary executions, as authorities have accused protesters of being enemies of God, which carries the death penalty. On Tuesday, the EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, said additional sanctions on Iran were being discussed. And Germany's chancellor said the bloc's foreign ministers were working to ensure that a peaceful transition to a democratically legitimate government can take place in the country. Words that need to be backed by action and driven by the will of the Iranian people, according to some analysts.
They don't want an Islamic republic. They should listen to the activists on the ground who have been calling for a transition.
One of the biggest question marks remains around what the United States is planning. President Donald Trump has dialed up the pressure by repeatedly threatening military intervention under the guise of a regime change. And on Tuesday, he took to social media and urged protesters to keep going, saying he had cancelled all meetings with Iranian officials and that, quote, help is on its way.
Well, for more, we're joined now by Arang Keshavarzian, author and professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme. As we heard there, Donald Trump saying help is on its way. He's already announced tariffs for Iran's trading partners. He is this evening threatening what he says will be very strong action if Iran goes as far as executing some of these protesters. How do you think Donald Trump is going to respond to what's happening in the country?
Good evening. Well, it's always very difficult to predict Donald Trump's actions. Frankly, I'm not even sure he and his team have a precise plan. While, of course, Iran has been on the U.S. foreign agenda for many years, decades, he came into the presidency wanting to focus not on the Middle East, and yet again, he's been dragged into Middle East issues. The military options are there, but supporting the protesters can't be done with just simply shooting missiles and bombing, for instance, the nuclear targets as the United States and Israel did in the summer. I suspect a lot of the discussion is around trying to support the protesters when it comes to communications, access to internet and information. Other than that, I'm at a bit of a loss as to what can be done. The sort of action that took place in Venezuela, it would be far more complicated in the Iranian case, where Iran is much farther away from the United States. The location of the supreme leader and the main generals are scattered and harder to locate and so forth.
And you mentioned communication there, Arang. With the internet blackouts that have been imposed on people in Iran, is it possible to actually have a clear picture of what's happening on the ground? Do you have any indication from people that you've perhaps spoken with?
Yes, it's been very difficult these last, now it's about 6 days I personally have only had a very spotty communication with my relatives there. Um, and it's very unclear. Even the people within Iran themselves are not sure what has taken place. Remember, it's not only that people from the outside can't communicate with people in Iran, but Iranians within the country don't have information about what's happening in different cities, different places. It is clearly there's been a lot of brutality, a lot of violence unleashed by the security forces in the past 3-4 days. We know hundreds, unfortunately, maybe even thousands have been killed. We also know that there's been a significant amount of violence by some of the members of the protests. We know that the government itself has named security officials that have been killed and shot and so forth. So it's a confused and confusing situation where while it is nice for Donald Trump to argue that the protesters can seize institutions, there's very little evidence that there is this sort of a mass organizations developed by the protesters or, for instance, by Reza Pahlavi to take on that task of taking over, for instance, ministries or radio and TV stations or anything like that. We're far, far from that level of organizational capacity by opponents to the regime.
And we've heard a lot of speculation the last few days as well about how this could possibly be the end of the line for the regime. How vulnerable do you believe the Iranian government is here? It's survived a lot in the past, from wars, rebellion, isolation, sanctions. Do you think this is the end of the line for it, or are we even close to that?
You're absolutely right to underline all of the challenges the regime has faced over the past 47 years, but especially the last, let's say, 10, 15 years. There's been countless protests, waves of protests, some of it around elections, some of it around women's rights issues, some of it around fundamental economic and social welfare issues. This moment, though, is a truly deep crisis because you have a kind of a confluence of all of these factors coming together all at once. You have this dire economic situation where clearly large portions of the population simply don't trust and believe that the regime is able to manage the economic crisis, the lack of access to hard currency, the skyrocketing inflation. Meanwhile, the regime also this summer was deeply weakened militarily and sort of embarrassed by the Israeli attack, not only on the country, but its own generals and so forth. So the regime is also weakened on the political front. On the other hand, my sense at this current juncture is that the opposition is, while incredibly angry, having a long list of grievances, they don't have the organizational capacities or the leadership to sustain this sort of level of protests for weeks and months. And that's frankly what a truly revolutionary change requires. So we're in a situation where there's a sort of a stalemate. There are many other scenarios other than the revolution that can emerge, such as a military coup or some other kind of fracturing or transformation. But there's a lot that we have to pay attention to in the coming days and weeks.
And what do you make of these calls for the exiled son of the last Shah to be reinstalled, Reza Pahlavi? How wide is his support base in Iran?
Well, I mean, one thing that can be said is that his, in a sense, his name recognition and the kind of public calling out of support for him in this past 2 weeks is far more than it was, for instance, 2-3 years ago during the Women Life Freedom protests or earlier years. But the confusing part for many of us analysts is when people take to the streets and say, long live the Shah, for instance, what do they exactly mean? Do they actually want the return of monarchy and Reza Pahlavi? Or what I'm more sympathetic to is a notion that there are so few good options for Iranians at this current juncture that he is the only concrete name that can come to the fore, which is a sad situation because there are many important democratic figures in Iran, some of them unfortunately languishing in prisons, but they don't have the organizational capacity to come together to build a big coalition. And until this moment, Reza Pahlavi has not truly reached out to neither other opposition figures outside and inside the country, but he hasn't even really reached out to the Iranian bureaucracy or members of the military to draw them away from the regime. These are exactly the sort of steps that most revolutionary leaders do, is to actually try to build a broad coalition intent. Most of Reza Pahlavi's energies these past couple years has been visiting politicians and capitals of foreign countries, U.S. and Europe and Israel and so forth. I don't see that as a recipe for supporting the deeply aggrieved Iranian protesters.
And Iran is claiming as well that this unrest is being manipulated from abroad. We might think initially here and specifically of Israel. Is Donald Trump going to be influenced by what the Israeli Prime Minister is perhaps saying to him?
I think obviously Israel has a close line of communication with Donald Trump and Washington, political decision makers and so forth. I would be surprised if Donald Trump makes a decision and keeps Israel in the dark. But at the other hand, we've also seen that Donald Trump is able to actually approach the Middle East independently of Israel. As for the Islamic Republic blaming everything on foreign terrorists and so forth, they've been doing this for years, decades. And while there is some truth that there are conspiracies, there are foreign groups and agents, the Israeli government and Mossad publicly claims that it has infiltrated Iran and so forth. So while there may be some of that, I believe most Iranians have tired of that line of analysis where all problems in Iran and all problems facing Iranians can be blamed on Israel, the United States, and outsiders. This is a situation where the political establishment in Iran has to take responsibility and has to devise a forward-thinking set of reforms, political, economic, social, and so forth.
Arang, thanks so much for joining us with that analysis. We'll have to leave it there for now. That is Arang Keshavarzian, author and professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. Thank you.